All right, everyone. We're going to move into Unit 9. So, Unit 9 is going to be fairly short comparatively to our last unit. And this is globalization after 1900. And globalization is something that you all talked about when you had geography last year in AP, human geography, especially. And so, a lot of this stuff might look familiar and be pretty easy to review, but we're going to go ahead and get to our first topic, 9.1, which is advances in technology and exchange. So, our essential question for today is: how has the development of new technology changed the world since 1900? And that is a pretty open question. There's a lot of examples that you can talk about. So, we're going to go over some in today's lecture. And then, think about all the different ways that how the world's changed because of technology for your answer. Okay. So the first area of how technology is trained is communication and the ability to move around. So movement has really increased in this last century, plus 20 years, and a lot of that's because of new technology. So ideas are moving, people are moving much more so than they used to prior to this era. During the 1800s, people didn't generally leave anywhere further than 50 miles from their birthplace, and it's even smaller if you go further back in time. So um, let's start with some new. Let's talk about the curriculum. What the language of the curriculum is: new models of communication, including radio communication, cellular communication, and the internet, as well as transportation, including air travel, shipping containers. Reduces the problem of geographical distance. Okay, so essentially these things shrink the size of the world and such. The radio, which kind of comes around in 1896, but doesn't really become popularized until the 1900s, early 1900s. It replaces the form of mass media that existed, not entirely, but as the new popular mass media, which was written. Newspapers, books, magazines, things like that. And so the ability to mass broadcast shows and information about what's going on really kind of ties the countries together more so. In the United States, we talk about this in APU's history of how it is able to bring, you could be living in Ohio and listen to music from New Orleans. You can be listening to, music and stuff from um, Georgia, different areas and such. It kind of really brings the world together. And so the idea of popular culture starts to develop more and more so because we see the radio as, the medium that broadcasts and everyone kind of is listening to the same shows. A lot of the cultural identities will start to break down by region. Um, well, those cultural region cultures and such break down a little bit more so in favor of more of a unified American culture itself. And it's not the only thing that radios can do. It's be a lot, but it does mass communication and then allows the presidents to speak directly to the people, as FDR did a lot himself. The telephone, which replaces the telegraph as a means to communicate across long distance. The telegraph, there's a limitation to how much you can say in a message, and if anyone's experienced where you text something today, and that text message was misinterpreted differently from the tone that you intended. That's a possibility of happening with the telegraph. But the telephone, you get to talk to the person directly. And the old telephones looked very different than they do today. Obviously, they had the little spinner things here. We had to spin the number, whatever you're trying to get, which was fun. My grandparents had one, and so making calls on that was kind of an adventure comparatively to the dial where we had buttons on our phone. But anyway, over time, phones become more and more advanced. The cellular phone, which is going to come around, invented in 1973, becomes more and more popular through the 80s and the 90s. And of course, today, I imagine many of you don't think about a world without your phones, as I've seen some of you in class where you can't not look at it every 5 minutes. But that is something that helps advance communication, gives more voice to people that didn't have one before and sometimes shouldn't have had one to begin with. But that's important to note. The internet, which kind of links to a lot of cellular stuff too, because a lot of smartphones today have access to the internet and so forth. That is something that is going to change the world itself. The internet originally was created by the U.S. military to continue to have communications, ability to communicate from base to base in the event that there was a nuclear attack. And then what it transformed to today is transformed our economy. It's transformed our way of life. It's really hard to imagine me living in a world where I can't just Google information when I don't know it off the top of my head. So, it's been revolutionary in how we live our lives, especially in the parts of the world that have access to internet, and the more developed areas of the world. Okay, transportation is also important to note here. The car, which is going to be made possible by Henry Ford's Model T and the assembly line, that which they can find the most efficient way to build cars. And Henry Ford's Model T made it possible to where they can put a new car out every 24 seconds out of their factory, and that's important to note because prior to the Model T, the car was just a plaything for the rich. It was like the equivalent of owning a private jet or helicopter in today's world. Not everyone could afford one, but then he made a car that was affordable for the common man using these mass production means, and it transforms our way of living. One thing I like to talk about, in class, which I'll just give a little short spiel here, is that it changes lots of behaviors of human beings, including dating behavior. And, like prior to the car, there was proper etiquette for dating is that when you wanted to court, if you were a young man who wanted to court a young woman, such, you had to go to the home, ask permission of the parents, and then the courtship and everything would happen at the home, with the parents and the family present. And some of you are already thinking, oh, I don't like that idea. But the car changes that, or the guy can come pick, the young lady up and then go out and onto town and go and, enjoy like some time together without the presence of the family. And, the automobile makes that more possible. And even though some people practice dating in that fashion today, it's much rarer than you would with people going out and enjoying each other's company without the presence of somebody else. And then the airplane, of course, invented in 1903 by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And the ability to fly makes it easier to go over great distances in a much shorter time. Of course, as technology improves on the airplane, going from propeller engines to jet engines, the ability to move around the world, it becomes much easier. And essentially, all these together shrink the world as is. And so geographical distance isn't as much of an issue in the 1900s as you would talk about in previous periods where it took days, months, years to try to move across the vastness of the earth. So think about guys like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, who we talked about in earlier parts of history, how long it took for them to take their journeys. They would be in astonishment to how easy it was for us to do what we can do today. Okay, so other advancements, energy technology, including petroleum and nuclear power, raise productivity and increase production of material goods. This is really straightforward. I'm not going to talk too much about this. Nuclear technology and ability to build nuclear power plants and things like that. It's not something that's found all around the world, but the places that are usually have the highest production because it can provide more energy. So then they have the power to run factories, to allow people to move transportation of stuff, goods, and people, and so forth between both nuclear and petroleum. And that increases production. And so during the 1900s, industrialization keeps rising. More and more stuff is produced. More and more stuff is available to people. And I also put a picture of wind and solar power, which are, technologies that are important for energy consumption today as well. They're fairly new on the scene, and they're still not the most efficient forms of energy, but one that people talk about more because of the potential environmental impacts, especially petroleum, and as well as nuclear energy. While nuclear energy is fairly clean, there does have the risk of potential dangers and harms that are a little higher than other forms of energy, but a lot of that is more myth than actual truth. All right. The next thing is more effective birth control. Gave women greater control over their fertility, transformed reproductive practices, and contributed to declining rates of fertility in much of the world. And I think I accidentally repeated that there, but birth control and the idea of birth control is not a new concept. There were practices of it in the late 1800s and then especially in the early 1900s. But the invention of the pill, birth control pills, which allowed women to control things so that they could put off having children until they were ready there and their husbands were ready. And at the same time, it also it has demographic consequences too. You know, prior to birth control, women would have lots of more kids on average than what you would see um, today in places where these things are readily available and practiced. And so this is something I'm sure you remember talking about in AP Hug about that the idea of family planning and population control and things like that. Women are putting off having families more so than they had in previous eras in more developed countries. Because they want to be part of the workforce. Sometimes it's necessary for them to be part of the workforce to afford to live in certain parts of the world. And so these are things that happen. And so, it definitely contributes to a decline in birth rates. But overall, our population in the world today is still continuing to rise. And we'll talk more about that, in next unit as well, and a little bit in this one too. But the ability to have more control over their reproduction of their body, their reproductive cycles and things like that, certainly kind of is a game changer in demographics and social orders a little bit too, as more and more women join the workforce because of that. All right, and then the last one is Agro Tech. Okay, so the Green Revolution, which is really an important event. It's one of the more important events since the Industrial Revolution, as far as human history goes. And so the Green Revolution, which kind of occurs between the 1930s and 1960s, sees a very big increase on new technologies that are going to be introduced into agriculture and new practices that will allow the yield of crops and food to increase significantly during this time period. And so, example of that is, go out to Kansas, Iowa, and so forth. If anyone's ever taken a plane that goes across the country, and you look down, you see all these circles and circle crop formations and such. All of those are attributed to the Green Revolution. And the ability to pump water out of the ground in areas that are generally pretty dry, and then on top of the fertilizers that are invented and such. We go back to previous periods, the Hesser-Bosch process, where we can extract nitrogen. Nitrogen is and ammonia, both. Are essential in terms of crop production. And every time you grow on a field, you take nutrients out of that soil. Well, then fertilizer kind of balances off that, and you put nutrients back into it. So our ability to fertilize, be able to get access to more water, and of course, Agro Tech, where you have these giant machines that are capable of doing the job, where you needed more laboring hands to harvest. You can have one machine that does a job of thousands of people. And so the yield, again, continues to grow and grow and grow, and pretty efficient today. I mean, think about how much food is generally available on the supermarket shelves. And that's one supermarket. And then you have how many supermarkets in our city, how many supermarkets worldwide. And then you add on top of that, all the fast food and restaurant chains in the world and such. We have an incredible amount of food available to us in this country. The United States itself is the number one agriculture producing country in the world, because of the technologies and the investment in technologies and infrastructure that makes that possible. And it's not just the United States, it's worldwide. Places like France, places that are more generally developed countries use large scale commercial agriculture in order um, to to provide for an increasing population around the world. Less than 2%. In more developed countries, less than 2% of the population is providing food for everybody. And that's a pretty amazing achievement. I also should mention, pesticides and GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or sometimes, as it says here on the screen, GMCs, genetically modified crops. They can genetically modify them to produce more, to have higher yields, to have a natural herbicide or pesticide inside it so that pests won't eat the crops before we were able to harvest them. So a lot of those things are important to note, and these is technologies that continue to play a huge role in the ability to produce more and more food and such. As far as livestock goes, I mean, used to be like, especially for cattle, we had just large ranges of cattle that would feed from grass, put them on a train, send them back to towards the east in the slaughterhouses and such. Nowadays, you see where they're raised to a certain age, and then they're brought to these concentrated feedlots, and then they're just fed corn, fatten them up, in 6 months, and then they go to slaughter, and then of course, packaged nice and neat on the shelves of supermarkets and such. So it's a very different world we live in than your grandparents or my grandparents lived in, as far as the how we're and the availability of food and how we get food today. Okay. So the Green Revolution, remember that term. It definitely changes the world in so many ways, and still continues to do so. Okay. Let me get this. All right. So medical innovations, including vaccines, antibiotics, increase the ability for humans to survive and live longer lives and such. And in 9.2, we're going to talk about disease a little bit more too as well. But medical technologies improve very much so over the last 120 years. And one of the things that you can include in that is the idea of vaccinations, where we've learned how to understand how the body defends itself against diseases. And then by vaccinating our bodies, it gives us an advantage for our natural immune systems to get a head start, to be able to identify diseases and then attack them if we do encounter them in the open air. So there are lots of diseases in the world today that we do not necessarily are as high risk of contracting because of our ability to fight them. And it's not just vaccines; it's antibiotics for bacterial infections. Think about penicillin, which when that came around, it made it possible for people, and especially when you're talking about surgeries, when you cut the body open, and despite how clean your instruments are, the doctors or whatever, there's always that risk that you're going to induce some sort of bacteria in there. And so penicillin ends up fighting that infection so that your body can heal and survive. And this, of course, I put this PowerPoint onto the Canvas page with you guys, but you look at, all of these different diseases that have developed vaccines or medicines that allow you to fight them. There is one I definitely want to highlight, person that is very important, and that's Jonas Salk. Let me get my face off of his. So Jonas Salk is going to create a vaccine for polio. And polio, if this is the first time you've heard of polio, you can thank Jonas Salk for that, because this was a disease that in the early parts of the 1900s was devastating, and especially affected children who can get this disease, and it would leave lifetimes of scarring on your body. And what I mean by scarring, I mean just like it could destroy your development. And so an example of a person who did get a polio as a child was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, during the Great Depression and World War II, he was stricken with it as a kid, and he didn't have the full ability to walk. And that is something that, if it didn't kill you, it certainly could have a lifetime effect on you. So polio was pretty devastating. If you can see in this graph here about the number of reports of polio in the United States since 1910, you can see how it kind of goes up and down and spikes during the 1950s. And then Jonas Salk, when he develops the vaccine, and then not only are you able to vaccinate people who are stricken with it, but you're also able to vaccinate the general population and improve basically herd immunization. The disease will not spread as much. So just it almost dramatically drops to nothingness. Like, you do not see polio in large cases. It is not an epidemic in our country like it once was, or around the world as much so, because of the ability to vaccinate and then isolate this disease to where it can no longer spread. And so that's pretty important to note, and why it's important for people to get vaccines, which today, because this happened so long ago, a lot of people forget this happened. And I think that's why you still see these anti-vaccination movements that occur, because number one, they just don't remember what it was like before vaccinations came along and why a lot of these diseases don't exist today. And number two, a lot of misinformation that is out there, unfortunately. But this is important person to note in his contributions. But altogether, if you don't have these diseases, it's probably because of that. And I know with the current situation, a lot of people worried about what's going on in the world today. Well, why don't they come with a vaccine for what's going on now? Well, I'm sure that they are working on it, and they are trying to understand it. It's a virus. Viruses are very tricky, and we are trying to find treatments for that today. And the fact that it took years and years and years to find vaccinations for a lot of these things. We are definitely pulling our resources around the world, and countries in the scientific community are working on it in a way that has never happened before, the sharing information and learning and stuff. And so hopefully in some lab somewhere in the world, we will find something that will help and stop the spread of this. So this goes back to our essential question. How has the development of new technology changed the world since 1900? Okay, and so your answer should have plenty of examples and areas that we can talk about. So make sure that you get on Canvas and do that in response to that question. That's it for this lecture. We will do 9.2 next, and that one will be relatively short and part of what we've talked about today.